Good evening, everyone. Welcome. That's better. My name is Hugh Price. I'm Academic Director of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and I'm just here this evening to introduce our speaker, someone I'm especially delighted to introduce because we've been trying to get her to come as a visitor here to CSER for quite a long time now, one or two false starts. So I'm particularly delighted that she's finally here. Only here for a week. I hope she'll be back for longer on another occasion. As you all know, it's Professor Heather Douglas, who has the, let me get it right, the Waterloo Chair in Science and Society at the University of Waterloo in Ontario in Canada. Very widely known for her work on science and science policy and value in science, particularly for her 2009 book, Science Policy and Value and the Value-Free Ideal, published by Pittsburgh University Press. So tonight she's talking to us on responsibility and inequality in a risky world. Welcome, Heather.
So thank you so much, Hugh, for that gracious introduction and the invitation to be here. It is, of course, entirely my fault, all those false starts. And also thanks to Adrian for helping to instigate the workshop that this talk is part of. I'm going to be trying out a new argument this evening, especially in the second half, so I hope that generates a lot of discussion. We'll see whether or not you think the argument works. I also would like to say that any similarities to the Pope's recent TED Talk is purely accidental. I did complete my talk before he did, and we might be saying some of the same things, but that's just utterly accidental. All right, so the list of sources of existential risk, and we are, of course, here under the auspices of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, grows with every decade. When I was a kid, nuclear weapons were the sole focus of discussions of existential risk, and of course we still have those, but we also have artificial intelligence worries, biotech worries, whether you're talking about synbio or gene engineering and gene drives, other possible self-replicators like nanobots, deep planetary worries like climate change, biodiversity loss, and resource loss, and even emerging diseases are perhaps oldest and most familiar source of existential risk. I mean, that's the one that's been with us for centuries, are now emerging more rapidly as we encroach increasingly on wild habitats. Oh, I forgot to do the slide that goes with this. So there's, yay, all these things that could kill us, or most of us. And, you know, there's also near-Earth objects, there's solar flares, there's a list, actually, in Cedar's office that's quite long. It's quite depressing. And then, you know, we have these representations of our relationship to planetary boundaries. So this is a very nice graphic representation. You might notice climate change looks like not that bad. So that lets you know how things are here. This is biogeochemical flows, phosphorus and nitrogen. We're completely messing that up already. And then up there is genetic diversity and biodiversity loss. This is one that we seem to have actually handled, but everything else, not looking so great. Okay. So, as these risks emerge and are clarified, the underlying worry is how to mitigate them, because I don't think fully eliminating them is plausible. To be alive is to be at risk for all kinds of things. So how should we manage or reduce the risks? For some of them, we have well-developed ideas, even if they're unevenly implemented currently. We know how to look for asteroids, for example, and we were even thinking of how to avert catastrophe if we find one on a collision course. Like we have models of sending up, you know, maybe nuclear bombs to nudge them in a different direction. We know how to work against nuclear proliferation, even if with the development of, say, laser isotope separation, it is likely to get more difficult. So the thing that made nuclear weapons manageable as a risk, at least in the 20th century, is that only states, nation states, could develop the kinds of large-scale facilities which produce fissile materials. Soon that may no longer be the case. So things get very interesting. And we know what we need to do to arrest climate change. But it is a matter of political will that we do it. Although my research on abandoning fossil fuels in the cold climate of Ontario suggests we don't quite have the technical ability, much less the will to do it completely. But maybe we're kind of close, at least with having the capacity, if not the will. But for many of the risks, the threat posed by AI, for example, a certain kind of genetically modified organism, especially with those with gene drives, or a wholly newly built self-replicating organism, whether synbio or nanotech, the management of risks is difficult. They occur at the very cutting edge of research, and what is possible and what is plausible is constantly shifting. How do we manage these kinds of risks, particularly when we need the scientists doing the research to be cognizant of the risks, be responsible for the risks, and manage the risks well? To answer this question, tonight I will first lay out how to think about responsibility in the practice of science generally. I will argue that the responsibilities to consider untoward and problematic implications of one's research is unavoidable, but potentially shareable for the scientist. I will talk about some of the ways in which responsibilities can be productively shared and talk about the ways in which scientists have done this successfully in the past. But this, we will see, are for the scientists and researchers who have goodwill, who intend the best already, who want to do the right thing. We desperately need those working with these increasingly powerful technologies to have goodwill, to not intend harm. I will argue that there is a way we can help tilt the scales in that direction, but doing so requires that scientists, engineers, and all those who work on the cutting edge include an aspect of social justice in their assessments of which projects to pursue. Existential risk, especially some of the most plausibly technically accessible worst-case scenarios, can be ameliorated by working to reduce, rather than inadvertently increasing, inequality in our interconnected and iniquitous world. Okay. So first, responsibility in science. We all share certain moral responsibilities by virtue of being part of the human community. Scientists have special role responsibilities as well, such as their responsibilities to carefully consider the evidence, to manage the data carefully, to treat colleagues and students with respect, and so forth. And now this is like the list that you go through when you do responsible content research. It's like this list of things you need to do. But the responsibilities regarding existential risk are first and foremost responsibilities that do not arise by virtue of being a scientist, but rather by virtue of being human, which I want to argue scientists are. Okay? So, the general responsibilities we all share are bounded. We are not responsible for everything that happens, but the boundaries are not simple. First, I just want to make clear that causal responsibility and moral responsibility are overlapping but not identical. You can be causally responsible for something you are not morally responsible for, so you're part of the causal chain, but you would not be considered praiseworthy or blameworthy for your part. So if, for example, I lend someone a book, and it happens that that book blocks a bullet later that night, I am not morally praiseworthy for lending them that book. That was just lucky, and it would be kind of weird to give me praise for that. And you can be morally responsible for something you are not part of the causal chain because you could have acted but didn't. So if you see someone about to step into a car, in front of the path of a car, and you just don't bother to grab them or warn them, yeah, you did something wrong because you weren't part of a causal chain you should have been part of. So for the remainder of this talk, I will be talking about moral responsibility, not causal responsibility. What are you morally responsible for? What are we all morally responsible for? Clearly, we are responsible for that which we intend. Right, that's that blue circle, intention. What you seek to make happen or to prevent is the center of most of what we consider blameworthy or praiseworthy. But intention is not necessary for moral responsibility. We are also responsible for that which we should have foreseen and should have acted upon, but didn't. It is in this way that we can be negligent, we can fail to pay attention and see a possible problem with a course of action, and that we can be judged reckless. We see the problem but do nothing to avoid it. We are not held as blameworthy or even as praiseworthy for these impacts of our choices as for those we intend. So once you get outside the sphere of intention, the burden of responsibility somewhat lessens. But they are part of our sphere of moral responsibility nevertheless. Thus, what we should have foreseen and acted to prevent or to cause, but didn't, can be part of our responsibility. And this is all counterfactual reasoning, so it can be quite tricky in practice. We do this regularly, though, in our courtrooms and in our communities, saying, you should have known better, or you should have seen that coming. And it is in reference to our communities that we decide what is foreseeable, what is plausible, and what we should have acted to forestall. So there's a big in courts, it's actually a reasonable person standard that's set by the jury of your peers. Obviously, we can't use that for everything, but it's a general way of thinking about what bounds this. Now, at the cutting edge of science and technology, this is doubly difficult. It's not just counterfactual. We are using counterfactuals in a novel terrain. And to keep this from expanding indefinitely or contracting into nothing beyond intention, where scientists hold each other responsible for the most tenuous leaps and possibilities that realize themselves from science fiction, or just disappears because everyone says you can't see anything beyond what you intend, I think we should bound responsibility here by what is concretely plausible. It is not just that someone could imagine with lots of gaps and few specifics, like, oh, if we just had a killer robot that was 60 feet tall, it could fight Godzilla. No, like that's just too far removed from where we actually are, is that someone could think specifically of how that outcome could come about. So I want to consider some real examples from the history of science to make this concrete. The first example is about nuclear weapons. So when was a nuclear weapon plausibly foreseeable? It was not, despite the brilliance of Frederick Soddy and H.G. Wells, in 1905 when Einstein first published his paper, =mc². At that point in time, no one had any idea how you'd actually get the energy out of any of the matter. And it wasn't until 1938, the fall of 1938, with the discovery of fission in uranium by Otto Frisch and Lise Meitner, that people realized that there was now a way to get a lot of energy out of matter. In fact, Leo Szilard, who'd begun looking at this problem in the early 1930s, thinking that maybe a chain reaction could do it, started at the other end of the periodic table. He was so wrong about what would plausibly do it. He thought, like, oh, we'll start with boron. No, that's not how you do it. So everyone was quite surprised that it was actually at the other end of the periodic table. It caught the physics community completely off guard that when Frisch came across the Atlantic with the news that he and Lisa had discovered fission, that they had estimated how much energy was released in one fission event. It's a lot. It's like an entire electron volt for one atom. That's like, if I remember this correctly, that's the amount of energy it takes to take a raisin and make it jump off the table. But that's just one atom, right? So it's a lot of energy. And suddenly, there was a very plausible way of how you could release the energy of the atom. Of course, December 1938 is a terrible time to discover such a thing. Right? And all the physicists in the world, the nuclear physicists who were at these meetings, were really alarmed. They were immediately thinking, like, oh God, what if Hitler does it first? What are we going to do? And a very interesting debate proceeded from these discoveries of a plausible, foreseeable nuclear weapon. They still weren't sure it could happen. They still weren't sure what the replication rate was, whether you could actually do this, whether you could separate the fissile material properly. But they now had a very concrete, plausible way in which it could happen. And so the debate in 1939 was how to manage that responsibility. They all felt it. None of them were like, oh, well, I just need to keep doing my research because I just care about knowledge. Not a single one of them thought that. They all thought, how do we manage this risk? And they managed it in different ways. So some of them argued that what they needed to do was stop publishing, like immediately. Don't publish any more results in this area. And some of them thought, well, we should keep publishing a bit, otherwise they'll be on to us. They'll know we're working on this, and that will make things worse. And some thought, oh, well, okay, but maybe we should keep publishing because maybe we'll discover it won't work. And if we keep working together, we can figure out that it's not going to work at all. So you have the same kind of debates you have today with real examples where there's disagreement about how to responsibly manage the risks involved. But no one thinks it's not their job to think about it. The second example is more contemporary, H5N1. As you know, H5N1 is a really nasty virus. It not only kills birds, it will kill humans. It infects, the human mortality rate is quite high. It's about 50%. This is a nasty virus. Luckily, it doesn't spread between humans easily. This is a good thing. Right? So right now, if a human gets it, another human tends not to get it because the virus isn't spreadable by sneezes, which flu usually is. So some researchers, particularly Ron Fauchier and Kawoka in Wisconsin, 2 different research tracks, were wondering, well, how hard would it be to make it spreadable by sneezes? And they were really hoping, I know now you're thinking like this was a bad idea. But they were really hoping that they would show that it would be really hard. All right, and most virologists thought like this is going to be really hard. You know, if the virus was going to be easily spreadable by sneezes, we would have already seen it. It would have already emerged. And we're probably going to show that it's really complicated and really difficult and virtually impossible. So they started giving it to ferrets, and they give it to ferrets because ferrets sneeze. It's like the only animal model that sneezes, and trying to get them to pass them to each other. And they discovered in, I think it was 2011, yeah, 2011, it takes just a handful of mutations to do it. Uh-oh. Okay, so now not only do we have like an increased worry about this virus, there's a controversy over what to do with that knowledge, because these scientists now know how to turn H5N1 into a very nasty bioweapon. Exactly which mutations you would need. And we're getting really good at gene engineering. You could also just use a tactics, gene sequencing, and just ask it to do the gene sequence, and you can make a live virus that way. So should they publish the results? Now, the fact that they got these results, the general idea was immediately public because Hauser-Raspe actually announced it at a conference, and it spread like a virus through the research community. But they wondered about whether or not they should publish the details. And there was a very interesting debate within the scientific community and within the broader science, both sort of virologists and the broader scientific community, of how to manage a case like this. So some researchers argued that it's really important to publish the details so that health workers on the ground can know which mutations to look for. But that presumes that they're actually looking at the various mutations they're coming across, which is not entirely clear that's happening. On the other hand, other researchers were arguing that no, actually, you should not publish this because then you have access to a very nasty bioweapon. You're basically publishing a blueprint. And it's not clear that it will help the public health machinery. So there was sort of a debate about what the actual practical details were. But most of the scientists, with the exception of Ron Fortier, who sort of said, we just publish results in science. No one ever keeps science private, which is just not true. Scientists have squelched publication in the past. In fact, in the case of nuclear weapons, I forgot to tell you, they stopped publishing completely by the fall of 1939, and doing so crucially prevented the Germans from pursuing the bomb project because the Germans got the cross-section of carbon wrong. And if they had published the correct version, the German bomb project would have been much easier to go along with. So the stopping of publication in 1939 proved really important in the history of the development of the atomic bomb. Okay, so this research ultimately went to the NSABB, and they decided to allow it to be published in the spring of 2012. What was interesting was that all the scientists involved agreed to withhold publication until the National Security Advisory Board on Biosafety made their decision, even though there was no sort of legal requirement that they follow the NSABB. So the responsibility that arose in both these cases felt onerous and interfering to the scientists involved. They were unhappy with the additional responsibility, but we're not shirked. The scientists had a vigorous debate about the desirability of the research, the desirability of pursuing it, the desirability of maintaining publication. So even though they mostly stepped up and acted responsibly, they weren't happy about it. Scientists prefer, I think in general, not to think about such things because thinking about such things can curtail their work as scientists. It might mean not publishing or not sharing research results. It might mean ceasing to pursue a particular line of investigation. Scientists don't like these curtailments and are drawn forward by the allure of what I've called technical sweetness in their work. Scientists don't like to ask, should I do this? They prefer to focus on the question, can I do this? Will it work? Perhaps this might even be a general human trait, not just scientists. Unfortunately, just because it might interfere with or make more difficult scientific work does not mean the responsibilities do not arise. Okay, now, so this is just what scientists have to live with because they're human beings. There are, however, ways that scientists can share some of the responsibility with others. Some examples are institutionally robust, and others are more experimental. For example, scientists now routinely share the responsibility for protecting human subjects with ethics review boards, which were instituted in the 1970s following some of the really horrific reports of things like the ski experiment in the US. That it took so long to initiate these things is actually quite disturbing. And people were thinking about the possibility of using those sort of oversight boards for dual use research. There's the Biosafety Advisory Board that I mentioned earlier. But the thing about these boards is that scientists can't completely offload the responsibility to such boards because issues can arise over the course of the research that raise ethical questions. And scientists want to make sure that their protocols, are ethical before going to the board, and then other things come up and they might wonder, if they just think they've offloaded the responsibility to the board, they forget that they have to keep thinking about the implications of their work. So scientists are now experimenting with similar kinds of things, but in most of these cases, the scientists have to bring the issues to these boards for help. So the scientist has to recognize there's a problem that needs to be addressed. These boards are usually consultative and have no binding or legal authority, or even though they might have powerful moral authority. Now, if attached to funding agencies, then the boards can recommend rules that might improve safety, or funding streams can make those rules mandatory, but such rules will always be behind the cutting edge of science. Regardless, the scientists themselves have to be alert that there might be a potential ethical issue. Now, this might seem like a tall order for scientists, because we are not very good at training scientists to be moral paragons. There's another mechanism that might help here, though, that's been pioneered by Eric Fisher and his colleagues at Arizona State University, called the STIR Project, Social Technical Integration of Research, where what they do is they embed a humanist or a social scientist in a research project for a short period of time to help the scientists, say like 6 months, to help the scientists become more alert to these issues and become more reflective about them. So these are not people to go in and make decisions for the scientists, but to help the scientists think through the issues that might be involved with their research practices, to help them become more aware about them, to think about the implications or how they might make decisions going forward. And this is what Fisher has called the midstream modulation model. So in the middle of doing the research, you make small adjustments that might make big downstream differences for the ethical implications of your work that no one ever really needs to know about. So like the fact that you're avoiding like the next deadly weapon as you sort of thread the line through isn't something you publish, but it might make a big difference in improving the impact of your work on society. And I think Fisher's work is really exciting, partly because he's shown that doing this actually also increases productivity among traditional members. So it increases the publication rate of the research groups. But embedding is always short-term, and the responsibility still rests with the scientists at the end. Finally, in really tricky areas, scientists could decide to work collaboratively with ethicists or stakeholders or citizens, just average citizens, to shape and run research projects. There are a range of ways to do this. So we could do advisory groups with citizens included. There could be advisory bodies, like the NSABP could have some citizens on it helping to make these decisions, like IRBs have. You could do an ongoing collaborative research project where you actually have a citizen group that you're working with that's helping to shape the nature of the research, the decisions that are made about how the research is scoped and how the research gets implemented down the road. And by the end of it, you end up with a body of knowledge that the citizen group actually has seen get constructed by the scientists and developed by the scientists. And so it becomes an object of great trust. So this actually has worked in a few cases. But unfortunately, it's not done very often because it's arduous, it's labor intensive. There are deliberative panels where social scientists have begun experimenting with getting representative samples of citizens and sequestering them for like a weekend or two, and citizens get to interact with experts and ask questions, but they get to deliberate separately, and they come back with recommendations for how to manage these kinds of ongoing technological risks. And then there's a Worldwide Views project, which is a way of doing that kind of expert deliberation, but all over the world. So the most recent one on climate and energy that I know about, they actually had 80 sites of 100 citizens each from all the continents deliberating on issues of climate and energy on the same day. And we got to tell them, we did one in Waterloo actually, and we sort of communicated with the other sites. It was a lot of fun. So these are different kinds of ways in which we could involve citizens in in scientific practices, that's much better than any sort of town hall model. I know that you guys have thrown a town hall model for GMOs. I don't think it went well, from what I hear. Town hall models, anytime you have people just coming up and speaking, or an expert on stage telling you what to think, if the expert's just on stage, they're going to do the DAD model, decide, announce, defend. Right? So they're going to just tell you what to think and defend it to the end of their teeth. And town halls are just places for people to vent, and they might be politically useful to have a place to vent. But it's not going to create the kind of rich discussion that you need to really grapple with these complex ethical issues. Okay, so where was I? Okay, yeah, so each of these comes with its own benefits and difficulties. Now, and none of these fully collectivize responsibility, except for maybe ongoing collaborative research. So even with all of them, you still have responsibility that rests with the scientist. It is the scientists pursuing their research, working at the edge of the new, who can be the first to see the plausible, potentially troubling possibilities and begin the process of ethical consultation. A scientist who thinks it is always someone else's job to do this reflection will fail to see the possible issues until we are too far down the road to make the crucial choices. So this is what nuclear physicists did in late 1938, and again what virologists did in 2011. I know of another example recently of a grad student who was working on an ultra-cold trap for atoms, and he realized that his research, if it worked, would produce an undetectable method for uranium enrichment. So anyone could do it in their basement. And he shut down his research. It's like, that's it. We're not going here. I suspect that many scientists do this regularly, and most of the time we never hear about it. It is just research that is not done or not published. So the responsibilities that come with doing science are in this sense inescapable, even if it is better if they are also shared in many cases. Sharing the responsibility can improve scientists' foresight and ethical reflection, can keep scientists from deluding themselves about the desirability of some outcomes, and prevent the allure of technical sweetness from blinding scientists about the possible downsides of their work. So I think these are all very useful mechanisms to be used in different contexts. Scientists need to have the conversations about these ethical issues regularly and often with people other than other scientists. But part of grappling with the demand for responsible science, I think, will require a shift in science education. In research ethics courses, scientists need to be taught more than the usual core of scientific integrity: fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, human subject treatment, and even the broader accounts, including mentorship and collaborators and data management, turn into unmemorable lists of disjointed things that you have to keep in mind. I prefer to think about the responsibility of scientists like this, that you have three basic bases for your responsibilities. One is to good empirical reasoning, so that's about no fabrication, no falsification, ideally good data management practices, good inference practices. That's very often taught nicely in research ethics classes. But you also have responsibilities to the scientific epistemic community. That's where you have things like don't plagiarize and treat your graduate students well, don't kill your postdocs. It's really important. Be a nice peer reviewer, those kinds of things. And then there's also responsibility to the broader societal context. And that's where we have responsibilities for treatment of human subjects and animal subjects. And the general responsibilities that I'm talking about with regards to existential risk. The thing about this terrain is that no one of these automatically trumps the other. They all have to be on the table all the time. And that's just the part of being a scientist, is the overlayering of all three areas. In my work on this, I actually, if you want the full account, I wrote a paper called The Moral Terrain of Science, where I talked about 4 dimensions of responsibility, where you have the 3 bases, the kinds of responsibility, general versus role, ideals versus floors, and collective versus individual responsibility. So you can go and read that paper and get the big account. But thinking through all of these things, I think for scientists in their education structure, this is good for philosophers, but this is really what scientists have to have in the back of their heads when they're doing their research all the time, that they have 3 bases all the time. Okay. Now, that's for scientists who have good intentions. who want to be responsible. What about, and we've seen how having good intentions is not sufficient, or more precisely that one must think beyond what one intends to be responsible. And perhaps after reading, after hearing this talk, such reflection is now required for you to have to say you have good intentions. And so maybe we could expand what it means to have good intentions. But without good intentions, we're in serious trouble. Having malicious intentions used to not be so dangerous. It was hard to get hold of fissile materials or to engineer and release deadly viruses. One needed samples of highly controlled hazardous materials in order to do anything threatening. Malicious actors could, of course, do lots of harm with the tools available, such as guns, small bombs, larger bombs, airplanes, things like that. And sometimes these malicious actors were even scientists. I actually know of 2 cases of scientists, one in the US and one in Canada, because Canada does have problems too, who shot and killed people in their department after being denied tenure. But the threats posed were localized, and at least not the scale of an existential threat to humanity or civilization. As we are increasing our technical capacity to engineer self-replicating machines or organisms, whether viruses, organisms with gene drives, nanobots, symbioorganisms, or AI, to serve as tools for a variety of ends, and they might be really useful for some of these purposes, the capacity to utilize this technology to cause deeply and widely felt destruction is also increasing. And I doubt it is possible for states to control the information or technology underlying these capacities. Part of the maker culture central to SynBio, for example, is that anyone can do it. And so the ability to tinker with these things is also becoming more widespread. The cost of the materials and of the infrastructure needed to do such work is also declining. So the ability to cause harm through these technologies is becoming, and will become most likely, more potent and more available. This is a risky time indeed. So, how do we ensure that people have good intentions? We cannot ensure it universally, but we can do things to help keep the risk of the malicious scientists to a minimum. After all, we're all about minimizing risk here, not eliminating it. So one of the foundational drivers of extremism in the literature on extremism is perceived injustice, unfair inequality. And there are additional drivers that follow from there, like if you have a sense of perceived injustice and there's a group identity and community that you identify with that has that sense of perceived injustice, and there's an offering of stability within that community and avenues for redress and charismatic leaders, then you can begin to see how you might get extreme action. But perceived injustice is one of those general things that you can say, this is the seed that starts the malicious action. And I know you've all experienced this. There's a great paper that came out recently about air rage. And it turned out, so air rage is an example of people experiencing perceived injustice. If you walk through business class on your way to economy class, it turns out this dramatically increases the incidence of air rage. Whereas if you board separately, like if business class goes in their own door and you don't have to walk through and see those jerks up there, then air rage substantially declines. This is a very mundane example, but it shows how perceived injustice can really sort of instigate angry responses in human beings. And we should not be surprised by this. So what we don't, so people get angry when they see injustices, and there are so many injustices to actually perceive. So here's just an example of life expectancy across the world in 2013. And, it's good to be in the purple and blue countries. It's not good to be in the orange and yellow countries. So it's a big difference. That's a 30-year spread between the deep orange and the purple. No, 40-year spread, sorry. Yeah, okay? And there's a childhood mortality by country. Now, the good news is it's been declining everywhere. The bad news is, Angola, this is still 16%. That's a lot of kids dying at a young age. So we have a lot of injustices in the world. Those are just some examples. And when we have these kind of very stark injustices, and the information is widely available. This is actually put together this wonderful Our World in Data. I think it's run out of Oxford. I shouldn't say that here. But it has beautiful graphs like this. And, anyone can look it up. So we have a question. We don't want that anger, even a small minority of cases, turning malicious, particularly with the increased technical capacities spreading through the world. So the tool we have to prevent, or at least mitigate this, is to reduce inequality, to remove the source of anger and the perceived injustice. And we should, at the very least, not be making the inequalities worse. So there are lots of ways to do this. For science, this means that in the shaping of our research agendas, we must think about social justice and inequality in deciding what to do. Thinking about whether some new capacity will make the already wealthy parts of society better off, even if that will make a huge improvement for those people, is inadequate and potentially harmful, even in terms of existential risk. We should not pursue projects that, even if successful and used as intended, exacerbate the world's deep inequalities. Who benefits matters just as much as how much benefit there is. Doing so in the information age, when images and stories of the world's new capacities speed across social media, will make perceived injustice even more prevalent, and frankly, rightly so. And perceived injustice with its righteous anger is central to generating malicious action. It is in this way that serving the wealthy exacerbates existential risk. So we have to confront the messy issue of justice in our research agendas and justice within a global context. And I think this can be really challenging. I expect it to be really challenging. Often because so much of one's research is tied to particular partners in particular places. You have ongoing research relationships, or to a particular policy regime that might be close to home, or to patterns of research that you're used to. And trying to work with those partners and local policy regimes makes sense for many scientists, because having a positive impact in context one understands is also more likely. But it cannot be done blind to the broader global context in which one works. All right, now I'm going to actually criticize something. Yeah, so to give this some teeth, let us look at a research agenda that I think fails the test. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so I think pursuing immortality is an example of something that actually will increase existential risk, which is kind of ironic, don't you think? So this is not about seeking overall gains in health. I think treating global disease burden is a good idea. Trying to make people live healthier lives is a good idea. This is about trying to remove death from the equation completely, which I think is a bad idea. Here's why. There are two general approaches. You could either make the body immortal, but the problem with this is if you have actually immortal bodies running around, this is obviously not something that can be done for everyone, probably because it will be really expensive. For those who it is done for early, living longer tends to increase your wealth and power. The longer you live, the more wealth you accrue. So this is going to exacerbate inequality. You're also going to be immortal, which is obviously an inequality. Yeah, okay. But worse, suppose we actually got to the point where you could really spread it around. Actually, you could also say, well, we could do it maybe by lottery, a global lottery. So it's not just the wealthy, the wealthy entrepreneurs don't get to do this first. We're going to actually just have a lottery, so it's just spread across 7 billion people. Maybe we'll try with the first 100. Utterly implausible. But you could imagine trying to do that. That would still create the inequality. That would make people really angry. So what happens when we actually made it successful so that everyone could become immortal? Like suppose we waited for the implementation. Okay, well then we have the possibility of a world where nobody dies. We already saw the way in which we're pushing the planetary boundaries. This is going to exacerbate things hugely, which means nobody gets to have any more kids. That's it. Because we can't increase population if we're immortal. The whole kid having thing has to stop. And ironically, I know this is a movie about humanity ceasing to be able to reproduce, but it shows really dramatically how awful we are without children around. We're not very nice when there aren't children around. And I don't think it's just because people are worried about humanity dying out. I think there's something about having children around that brings out a really good aspect of us as human beings, of caring about something vulnerable, of bringing something into the world that's new. And for science, it could be catastrophic. After all, I just want to give you the Max Planck quote. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents, making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die. So imagine what happens to science if we stop dying. Oh dear. Okay, so I don't think the continuation of us as embodied humans, even if the continuation of humanity was ensured in general because we were now immortal, a childless world, I think, is not a desirable world that we want to actually exist in. But what about, most people think that's just kind of crazy, you know, we don't actually want to have immortal bodies, we just upload our minds, right? That's the other path to immortality. And this either, again, privileges the few or is physically too demanding. So I asked my colleague Chris Elias-Smith, who's a computational theoretical neuroscientist, is the perfect person to ask this. What would it take to upload a mind? He's like, well, you know, between 1 and 5 petabytes of storage, most likely 5 petabytes of storage for a mind, because you need all the synapses and all the synapse connections and some of the synapse states, and that's going to take at least 5 petabytes for one mind for storage. Now, currently on the planet, we have about 50,000, and you might, this I'm not so sure about because it's really hard to get a good estimate, but about 500,000 petabytes of storage. So that means if we wiped all the data, we could upload maybe 100,000 people, maybe. That's less than 1% of 1% of the global population. So this is clearly, again, a trick for the very few. And that's not even for running the mind. That's just storing it. There's no like experience associated with that. You're just like statically, your brain is statically existing in some stored thing. To run it, a lot more capacity. If you want to be immortal, I actually recommend writing a really good book instead. Because people actually read it. I'm not sure anyone's going to run these minds once they're uploaded. You might just leave them in storage forever. Okay. So, along either path, who gets to defeat death? The wealthy, privileged few, which is enough to make the rest of the world angry. And I think there's no work to do this work that I can see that will not substantially worsen inequality, anger, and resentment, and that will thus increase existential risk. I think a similar story could be told, say, about humans leaving the planet in the threat of eco-catastrophe, like, oh, we could escape to another world. Not 7 billion of us. Right? So that whole research agenda is a way of sort of offloading the risk of the ones left behind that you're going to have by continuing to see if we could get us to another planet. So what are we to do? We should think about the work we are doing in all fields and check to see that if the work is successful, if we achieve our goals, will those benefits go exclusively or primarily to the top 1% or 1% of 1% on the planet, or whether there is genuine benefit for most people, like all 7 billion of them, or most of them. Note that this is actually a less stringent standard than Rawls's second requirement for dealing with inequalities, which is that it must benefit everyone, particularly the least well-off. Right? And maybe we should have that standard, which is more stringent. I think there is research that does not meet even this minimal standard. So, this might sound really hard, but I think it's not as hard as it sounds. I think a lot of scientists do this already. And there are ways of trying to sort of instigate this kind of research more. The MacArthur Foundation recently put out the 100 and Change Challenge. They had 200 worthwhile projects submitted from all over the world. They're picking some semi-finalists and finalists now. But it's a very interesting selection of people genuinely trying to make a difference positively for a broad swath of the global population with various kinds of projects. And the fact that there were 200 multi-interdisciplinary teams, very large, and each of these grants were for like $100 million. So they were big projects. This is a big project for social change. You could just go on SciDevNet, which is like a newsletter for science in the developing world, to see all the kinds of things that could be done. Addressing global mortality and morbidity threats, climate change mitigation. It's clearly any kind of research on that might be addressing what will likely impact the least well-off the most. And there's also the Virtual Institute for Responsible Innovation, of which I remember, where we are trying to think about these things on a regular basis. Okay. Yay, conclusion. She's almost done. So my argument here means that social justice concerns should be at the forefront and center of our discussion of existential risk. Indeed, in our decisions about which projects are worth pursuing, both personally and institutionally. So if you're doing work that will benefit only the few in practice, you're actually worsening existential risk. So stop it. We have enough existential risk already. We don't need to make that any worse. I think it's ironic that some of the research agendas that are sort of folded under addressing existential risk might actually be more likely to be causes of it. What justice aim we want to have for research, I think, should be an open discussion, but one that we need to have. So what should be the minimum floor for justice considerations? And a plausible account of the justice aims should be a requirement for research. So generally, in thinking about responsible science, I think it's important that scientists don't just say, what can I do, but what should I do? And I think actually a lot of scientists already do this. They must think beyond the outcomes they intend and think as well about plausible outcomes they may not intend. And they can ask for a lot of help doing this. They can ask for collaborators from social sciences, from philosophy, from the Virtual Institute for Responsible Innovation, from citizens. And they can ask for help in deliberating over the moral issues embedded in research generally. I think if we have scientists doing this, then we can say we are actually doing our best, which is what counts. Thank you.
Okay, so we have, I suppose, about half an hour for questions. So, do you want to start?
Me
Yeah,
start?
go for it.
Okay, so I'm sure you've thought about this, but I've noticed that you frame it as perceived injustice.
Yes.
So there are some, angry white males out in the Midwest of America who, they're the ones that do the bad stuff. So,
In the US, yes.
there's two ways to address it. You can address it by reducing the injustice, and that's your proposal.
Right.
The other way you can do it is by reducing the perception of injustice.
That's what the airlines are doing with the business class. You just the perception of injustice. You just don't see what's behind the curtain. So I think in cases where there is a genuine injustice, the thing to do is to address the injustice. That would be the right thing to do. And I think in case where there's a perceived injustice, there are sort of two ways to go there that might be productive. One is to just point out that the perception might be totally skewed. Another is to point out that there might be an injustice, but it might be not what is actually being diagnosed as the injustice. And that might actually even be more productive. So, in the case of, say, Appalachian America, mortality rates, life expectancy is actually falling in some of these communities. That's a problem, right? And we should worry about why that is and what's going on there, and not just be like, those, I don't even know what to say. It's not being recorded. So there are, I think, ways of thinking about that might be productive. But sometimes perceived injustice is just perception, or is so small, and you're like, oh, come on, get over it. Maybe the airline case, I'm actually not that exercised by.
But you do think that malicious intent comes from that.
So that's what the social science research at least is showing, right? So it is an intuition that I share with it, but yeah, there's if you look at the reports of like mitigating extremism, the first thing they usually talk about is perceived injustice, and that's the kernel from which it all begins.
Or the rationalization that comes out.
I don't have to unpack the details of the science on that, right?
I'm collecting a list as I go, by the way, so if you want to just indicate to me, I'll put you down. I think Michael wanted to.
So there's a follow-up on this, actually. I want to push a little harder on one way of asking Miriam's question. There's lots of injustice that's not perceived. And your argument is, the actual kind of clever part of the argument in the second part turns on the perception piece.
Yeah.
And I mean, for example, you might think, that ideology prevents people from seeing the biggest injustices. And so, but then none of the argument doesn't work, right? Because you just said it's the perception of the injustice. Whereas, in fact, I know you're interested in the injustice itself, and the Rawlsian principles about the injustice itself and all these other things.
Yeah. Okay. It does rest on the perception, but in some of the cases that I was talking about, I think in the case of immortality, there's just no way to do it without it being glaringly obvious. If 10 people in the world get to be immortal, the rest of the world has the right to be kind of angry about it. Especially if people are already wealthy, and that's just going to increase their wealth and power. Yeah.
But like healthcare disparities.
Healthcare disparities. So I don't have enough detail about the way in which different kinds of justice. I know that for some ideologies, it's more about the West has been seen as being an overarching power of extracting resources. That's accurate if you look at the flow of capital and the impacts of colonialism on a lot of these cultures. I don't think that's completely, it's not just a perception. So then we need to ameliorate some of what's going on. And this is actually really difficult in engagement with science in the developing world. I held a workshop on this in 2015, and one of the difficulties was how do you go to developing world context, work with the local context, and not end up doing, again, an extraction of like paper publication out and intellectual capacity out. Like, oh, this person's really smart. I want to get them out of this context where they can get an education. But you just extracted another resource out. How do you break that kind of pattern so that it's not just another extraction? It's really difficult, right? But yeah.
Jacob? Heather, thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious about your requirement that, I take it as a necessary requirement, that if scientific research plausibly leads to an increase in inequality, it ought not be done. Now, arguably...
Sure about that. I'm trying this out, honestly.
Well, this is something to think about that.
Yeah.
Arguably, a large proportion of scientific research currently increases inequality, not necessarily due to direct effects of the research per se, but because of the broader context in which the applications of that research are employed. Right? So think about, say, developments of healthcare technology that are meant to apply to diseases that affect people in the Western world.
Right.
So if we increase longevity in, say, Canada, we're contributing to global inequality. Now, I take it you don't want to block all of that sort of research.
Yeah.
So do you have a way of distinguishing between, I guess, direct increases in inequality from indirect?
What I want to say about that is I think people should be thinking very hard when they're working on disease issues, say medical research, on whether or not the interventions they're talking about could plausibly be rolled out across broad swaths of the population. And I'm really heartened by the efforts to develop vaccines, for example, that don't require refrigeration, because that's a huge problem for the efficacy of vaccines. So there are sorts of ways of thinking about reducing disease and treatments. If they all require very sort of high-tech and very specific conditions, at this point in time, I don't want to cut that funding stream off completely. That seems a little draconian. But I really like to see a shift towards this research that might actually be deployable across, say, half the world's population, as opposed to a very narrow slice on the very top. Yeah.
Thank you.
We should just talk about redressing the balance a little bit,
So this follows on, I guess, is that when something's really urgent, like say we've got to stop burning fossil fuels,
Yeah.
so we've got these wonderful electric cars, so now we have to mine gigatons of lithium, which has got to be done in the places where people live who don't benefit from these electric cars.
And who didn't cause the problem to begin with.
Yeah, what must I do? What should I do? Should I not develop electric cars?
So there, I think, there are ways of working with local communities to make sure you aren't totally screwing them over to get the material out. So I don't want to just say that, oh no, you should never use materials that you might have to extract out of less impoverished places. But then you have to manage the extracting very carefully and make sure that.
But if I'm working for Elon Musk, I'm not working for the mining company, so I have to assume that the minerals will be extracted ethically, or do I say, they're not, therefore I won't work for Elon Musk?
Well, I think that you want a company like Elon Musk to actually have social responsibility standards in place when they're working with these companies, and to make sure and to actually audit them regularly on those bases, and go to the places and make sure that what's happening is on above board.
And but to get back to my point, that when we haven't got enough time, so we've got to say, well, we don't have enough time. We've got to get on with it.
I'm pretty sure you could just go and look and talk to the people there. It's not going to take that long. Maybe a weekend, right? Come on. So part of it is about bothering.
Well, she'd stop flying too. About
Yes.
bothering.
Well, I'm going to fly less this year than I did last year. But yeah, so I've run a decarbonization project in Waterloo, and it's really difficult to see how in cold climates, which Ontario is, how you get off fossil fuels. Just the natural gas for heating is a big chunk. But there are all kinds of ways and approaches of thinking about this. Energy is something that is consumed locally and very often is tied to local infrastructure decisions. I'm appalled that Cambridge has so many incandescent and halogen lights. Where are the LEDs? Come on. It's ridiculous. It's so inefficient. And that actually would dramatically alter, if you actually cleaned up the lighting, could dramatically alter the electricity consumption. And I hear you guys are still using coal. Or not in Ontario. Yeah, I'm not going to be too proud about that, don't worry.
I think I might ask a question myself.
Yes.
I'm allowed to.
You can give me a hard time too.
Well, I'm kind of interested in what I'm supposed to do, because as a scientist, when I'm trying to tell to what extent this is going to increase or decrease inequality, or be neutral with regards to it, considering that whether or not a particular technology is going to increase or decrease inequality is going to depend crucially on things that I don't have control over. As a scientist, things like, that's good.
Let's go back to this slide.
Okay.
Yeah, so sometimes you might not be able to tell, right? So do you have a plausibly concrete story to tell? And have you talked to other people that might also have thought about the context you're thinking of deploying, and sort of figured out what are the likely outcomes, and how could you push it towards the outcomes that are the ones you want?
And I take it you could end up saying things like, as a scientific community, we would love to research this, but unfortunately, you don't have the structures in place such that doing this would actually, not increase inequality.
That's right.
And so we're not going to do that research until you sort that problem out, which is kind of at least a fun thing to say.
That might create some interesting political pressure.
Yes.
It's not too willing to say that. Yeah, that could change a lot of discourses.
Right, Kyle?
So I was hoping to mention two sort of complications that you didn't talk about, and ask how, if at all, you think they affect how we want to make the machine run. One of them's already sort of come up and just did. One is how unbelievably terrible we are at foreseeing consequences correctly, especially consequences of things like new technologies, right? The lithium mining is a great example, right? When you're deciding to research electric cars, that's not what occurs to you. Oh my God, right? We're going to have to strip these lithium countries. And so I'm curious, in a way, about that one. I just want to ask: does that matter? Right? How does that impact the functioning of machinery? The other one I wanted to mention is the citizen panels and embedding humanists with scientists and that kind of stuff. I think it can be easy to go too quickly to the idea that that's how much of a solution we're going to get out of that, in part because the whatever special expertise it is that the humanists have, I think as often as not winds up frustrating scientists, because humanists are very good at coming in and saying, well, this is how you think about these this kind of deep problem, and this is, what the consequentialist thinks, and this is what the deontologist thinks.
That's not usually what happens when you have an embedded humanist.
So
So I would look at Eric Fisher's research on this. He's done dozens, literally dozens of placements all over the world in different labs for different contexts. And what you don't want is the philosopher who can, or the social scientist who can only think within their usual theory. That's not the one you send. And he, that would not be a good idea. Like, well, if you're a Kantian and if you're a utilitarian, no, that's not. The one you send is the person who can actually talk to scientists and help them think about the emergent ethical issues that they're dealing with. Now, I think you're absolutely right. It doesn't solve these sorts of, there is no one silver bullet solution that this will fix it. But it's one of the things that can ameliorate some of the complications of the fact that currently we have lots of scientists who are not great at thinking about these things, right? And that's a problem of our education system, and we can't fix that overnight. So in the meantime, we could use some of these models, but you don't send the disciplinary philosopher. That's a terrible idea.
Well, I think the broader kind of concern is there's a kind of open-endedness to inquiry in the humanities, right? At the end, we're often inclined to leave open. Okay, so what do we do now? And that's the stage in the conversation that where I think scientists tend to get frustrated. They're frustrated being told, yeah, this is a really deep, important issue, and wow, there are these complicated considerations, and I still don't know what to do, right?
So for the embedded humanists that have gone to these, done these sorts of things, the stories that come out sound more like this. Someone comes and says, I'm worried about this particular implication, and the social science humanist says, okay, here are some things you can do to help work through or think about that. Or maybe we should have a small group meeting where we all talk about it. Or maybe we should bring in someone who's actually dealt with the community you're worried about interfacing with. These sorts of things are what happens, as opposed to like, oh, well, let me come up with the,
I see.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, what are the bounds of our responsibility? In the following way, many of us in here are very still young in our careers, and we have, in this room, a wide range of talents that we could develop, questions we could address, work we could do. And some of that would improve the world and reduce inequality more than others. Do we only have to worry about the plausible consequences of the work we want to do? Or do we have a responsibility to think about what our capacities are and which of those would make the most difference in the world? In other words, are most of us in here bad people?
Well, I think you should listen to Kant on this point, where as a rational being, you are an autonomous end in yourself. So don't think of yourself as merely a good producing machine. Right? Think also about what would make you happy. Now, don't also go around screwing up other people. but it's not just about, getting the maximum good out of your lifespan, because you're not just a utilitarian end. I think it's really important for every student to hear this at some point in time. I didn't think you need that, Bennett. I thought you already knew.
I am going to change the subject. I come from the world of praxis, and I see very much, actually, when I listen to you, that artificial intelligence actually has already started to change the way we live, work, and the inequality is rising by the second, the more it goes into our lives.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you have already done about it, because it's getting too late.
Yeah.
And the second thing, which is a question for me, that actually I like this model, but don't you think that our intentions are very much always go back to our values? And a lot of people are actually not even aware what are their true values.
Yeah.
So maybe we need a little circle in the intention circle and call it value. Also culturally, different countries,
Yeah.
The whole thing.
Right. Yeah, I did not try to unpack the blue circle. There's a lot. There's a lot that you could unpack there. So I don't know that much about, I don't work on AI, right? There are people here who do. There's Yeah. I know there are people here who work on this. I think there's a lot of things to think about with AI and how to make sure that it is a tool that is not exacerbating inequalities further. To make sure it's a tool that makes the world a better place. I think that the people who are working on it are worried about that. I'm trying to help frame the questions they might ask of their work in a particular way. Like, that's mainly what I do as a philosopher, is help people give the right. I help people give people the right questions. Occasionally I do things like actual practice, like the decarbonization project was a project with about 50 local experts, 75% were from outside of academia. And that was a really fun exercise where I helped structure a deliberative process over a few days on how we might actually get the carbon out of our energy systems locally. But mostly I think about what kinds of questions we should be asking of ourselves and what's the normative structures. So I wish I could tell you more about AI, but
Yeah, so I don't know if social science still says this, but I think for a long time what social science said is that you get perceived inequality during periods of rising expectation. So it's actually when things were getting better in the French Revolution that you started getting revolutionary symptoms. It's the 9/11 bombers were coming from Saudi Arabia. They were actually coming from the rich parts. And it seems to me that there's this kind of hill climbing. I mean, there's one moral point, which is that you might want to just reduce inequality in general. But there's this kind of hill climbing story that frequently happens where reducing, what you're going to be doing is increasing both certainly perceived inequality and maybe actual inequality in the short run. That's what the rising expectations are about. And you look at the sort of overall hill, and whatever else you say, you compare Francis Bacon's time to ours, and you have 1 in 5 children everywhere in the world dying.
yes,
Versus,
well, much higher actually.
at least 1 in 5.
It was actually about like 2/3
yeah.
in the early 19th century.
So the problem is, but there's a kind of, there's a hill climb of the Industrial Revolution, for example, when things are getting worse for people in the cities versus people in the country. That is part of that process. And I think the point about perceived inequality is a particularly vivid one, because there does seem to be this generalization about it's rising expectations that cause perceived inequality. Now, you don't want to set up a world in which there's never rising expectations.
That's right. So I'm not sure, in the research I was looking at, the rising expectation stuff showed up, but it wasn't as strong, because some of the perceived injustices had to do with historical treatment. That was a key driver for some of it, rather than rising expectations. Certainly, for the example I gave you of immortality research, there you have the problem of rising expectations and really inequitous distribution, coming down the pipe. So, if regardless of which is the underlying cause of the worry, that's a bad idea. And it might be that we should think really hard about research agendas that create really rising expectations, but there's no plausible way in which it distributes well.
So I'm going to ask people to start being efficient, because I want to make sure there's quite a few people on the list, and I want to try and get through as many as we can. So in the hoodie, please.
Thanks very much for the presentation. I will change a little bit as well the topic. I'm interested also in political activism a little bit from scientists, because you were saying that we have to remind scientists that they are people, but I think we have to remind them that they are also citizens.
Yes, that too.
What do you think, which are the ways of making them more politically active?
Okay. So in my own work, I have been arguing that scientists should fully embrace and understand the role of values in their work, social ethical values. So science shouldn't be value-free, but it still has integrity. When I present this work to scientists, it's often a bit of a relief for them, because they know that the values are there, but they haven't been able to talk about them. So it's very helpful to get them on the road to being, I could be also an engaged citizen, to be able to openly acknowledge the values. And it's very interesting to me that in research, social science research, and of course there are only 3 or 4 of these studies out, so who knows if it's robust, But that scientists owning their values publicly does not seem to reduce their credibility. Hooray, right? So again, scientists can be humans and citizens at the same time. Now, the thing that seems to be undermining of scientists' credibility in the public policy sphere is if they are viewed to be sort of paid-for activists or have already ideological commitments such that the evidence won't really impact their views. But frankly, if that's going on, then we shouldn't be listening to them anyway. Right? So we have to get better at sort of sorting out the people whose views are actually responsive to evidence and argument and those who are not. Right? And see one as sort of responsible engagement and potentially advocacy, and other as maybe irresponsible engagement and advocacy. And that's where I think the sort of dividing line should be made. And if we can articulate that role for scientists better, they might be more willing to step into it and feel secure in doing so.
That's it.
Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering whether you thought about the implications of your argument for scientists and science funders with regard to intellectual property, because it seems to me in the UK and the US, the number of commercial patents produced by scientists or as a spin-off from university is seen as like super important for the scientific impact factor. There was recently a piece on that for in order to argue for the scientific budget or so in the new administration. And this seems to be at odds with the idea of rolling out the fruits of the research across the world. And I've been wondering in particular how we could somehow get data on when scientists decide not to patent their research, in particular because they want it to be more widely spread. Do you have any ideas on?
Well, sometimes scientists patent their research precisely because they want it to be more widely spread. So if you hold a patent and then you decide to license it freely to the people you want, you get to control the intellectual property and you get to make sure that it gets used widely. So a patent doesn't have to be sold for money, or a license to a patent doesn't have to be sold for money. It can be used in really socially positive ways. That doesn't happen all the time. I know one colleague, she's a friend of mine. She has a patent on a mouse that she is used for research, and she never sells the license for the patent, but she gets to say who gets to use her mouse. And if she thinks you're going to use it for purposes that she finds suspect for all kinds of reasons, she'll just be like, no, you don't get to use my mouse. I will keep my mouse. Right? So I know the patenting itself need not be the problem, but it's a really complicated, difficult issue when so much of public policy is driving scientists not just to patent, but to commercialize, to make money off of the science. And I think that's a huge policy mistake, especially with science pursued with public funds.
You can choose.
Thank you for your talk. You talk about perceived global injustice as a source of malicious actors. But we know there are other malicious actors. We have governments that.
There are psychopaths.
I mean, we have governments that will harm people in other nations because they perceive it in their national interest, or we have corporations who will pursue risks we consider unethical because they're in source of profit. And with many of the risks from new technologies like these biotechnologies and AI, surely in the same way that a cool new technology would be available to the rich before it's available to the poor, the dangerous technologies are available to these corporations and governments before they're available to those harmed by injustices. And so is the strategy for dealing with these strong actors different to the strategy you want to use to deal with the actors harmed by injustice? And if it is different, do you think it is compatible with a focus on reducing inequality?
So thank you for raising the question of states and corporations. One of the things I think is really interesting about the way in which the technology is developing is, and I can't tell how it's going to go yet, but right now it looks like it might actually become very widely available, regardless of the infrastructure you have available to you. So there is, there's something about being a corporation or a nation state where if it's traceable back to you, you've got a PR problem at the very least, if not, potential sanctions or a national criminal court. But if you're an individual, it might be easier to hide the fact that you're the instigator. So I'm not sure which is more worrisome. Because we do have sort of accountability mechanisms for these actors, even if we are terrible at making the world just with them all the time, they at least exist. And we can use those sorts of pressures for at least shaming these large actors publicly. So I don't know which to be more worried about, to be honest. This is also my theoretical problem. I tend to think about individuals more than institutions. I think it's part of philosophical training, is an individualist focus, and it has weaknesses.
Yes, it's you. Yeah.
Yep, go. You're saying scientists are not good at asking these questions, and I wondered, how do you know?
Well, some are and some are not. And I know this not because I have, because other people have done surveys of scientists, and a lot of times they will say things like, "It's not my job to think about the unintended consequence of my research." I've also given this talk to, or not this talk, but I've never given this talk before. Similar talks about responsibility, just a responsibility framework to scientists, and they'll get up and say, "But why is it my job? I don't want it to be my job." And you see this actually in some of the sort of foremost literature. So Percy Bridgman in an essay in 1947 just said, "Oh, well, clearly thinking about the societal impacts of research is just too hard for scientists. Like they have, doing science is hard enough. Don't make them do this too." Apparently he, backtracked on that view later, but he never published the backtracking. So this is what we have from him. So it's just because of those kinds of things. I don't think this is universal. I think many scientists are very good at thinking about these things. But we don't have really good accounts of how they're doing it.
Relatedly, and coming back to what Carl was saying earlier, when I've spoken to scientists and engineers who've gone through this embedding process, not STIR, but other types, the frustration is less about the jargon and the unfamiliarity with the discipline, but more a lack of clarity surrounding the intention of both parties. So the scientist or the engineer, they want to make a widget, they want to make it in a responsible, ethical way that will help the world. Maybe because their funder told them they had to or whatever, they find themselves in this embedded situation. It's unclear what the STS person or the social scientist's motivation is. Do they want to help the scientist make the widget, or do they want a nice case study and a book deal?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, if you need responsibility within natural sciences and engineering, do you also need to be reflective of that responsibility within the social sciences?
Yes, it is all reflexive. And it applies to my work too. Yes, it does. So in fact, when I did the decarbonization project, I was talking to people outside of academia, and they were all asking me, so what do you get out of this? And I was like, I'm going to publish nothing, because I'm doing this because I think someone should, and it's about time, and I at least have a framework that might be interesting to try, but I don't expect to publish anything. And then they all relaxed. They're like, "Oh, we can trust you now. You're not going to just come in and extract data out of us and go back and publish a couple papers." And that was really interesting for me to see, that if you're just viewed as an extractive resource, regardless of which side of the table you're on, then you have serious trust issues. That shouldn't be terribly surprising, right? I mean, this is again what Kant told us.
Oh, no, sorry, it's I don't know if we have time for you, sorry. No. You, not you.
Thanks, Ella. As this narrative has been developing, it seems to me a central question is the power of the scientist, essentially. What power does a scientist have? Does science have? I would argue that at the moment the power is legitimised by the pursuit of inequality.
Oh dear. That's terrible if that's true. Why do you think that?
Well, just think about the way science is funded, the national or political bloc causes for which science is funded. Whether or not it's done by scientists is one thing, I think. They have a wider purview, but the systems and the context and the institutions in which science takes place are designed for inequality.
Okay, so now I'm going to do a Rawlsian move on here. Not every inequality is an injustice.
Yeah, okay.
Right. And if doing science genuinely makes the world better for everyone, especially the least well off, then it's okay. But you have to actually make that case. Some science and scientists make that case, and some don't. Yeah. Okay.
Gentleman in the blue t-shirt.
Do you think if you exhibit restraint in the research that you choose to pursue because of this, but someone else doesn't, does that in itself create inequality or injustice?
Okay, so suppose this is a great question because it's partly about inevitability. Right? Like if you don't do it, will someone else do it? And if they're going to do it, does that mean you should do it first? Is that what you're really asking?
And does it create inequality, which is the whole thing that I suppose we're trying to control?
Well, I mean, I don't think, so if someone else does it, and you, like, suppose we're talking about the Harvard student who was pursuing the cold atom trap, and they said, okay, I'm not going to pursue this anymore, and maybe that delays their getting a PhD for a couple of years because they have to find a different project, right? Not a huge inequality. The thing I think that scientists need to keep in mind all the time is just because even if you think someone else will do it, if you do it first, you are, and you intend to do it, you're fully responsible for it. So think really carefully if you want to be that person. Maybe you're like, no, I don't want to be that person. In addition, if you actually have conventions about what are or are not ethically acceptable, so some of the dual-use oversight boards are playing around with the sort of conventions about what can't do. Since the early 70s, we'd have biological and chemical weapons conventions, and it's just illegal to do research of a certain kind on these things. Even if you think someone else might do it first, it would still be illegal for you to do it. And that sort of shows that it does come down to you making the choices of what you're going to do. So, yeah, inevitability is no excuse.
Let's squeeze in one more question.
So I'm a life science student, but I hope this applies to more areas.
Yeah.
Are researchers responsible to do more applied research rather than basic research to help? Although knowledge also helps decrease inequality, but
excellent question. So part of me is perplexed about how to answer this question because I can't tell what anymore should be considered pure versus applied research. Right? When I hear health research talk about, well, if I'm going after the fundamental mechanism of cancer, that's pure research, I'm thinking, what? And I wrote a paper about the history of the pure versus applied distinction and how artificial it was, historically, sort of constructed out of thin air as an excuse to sort of gain resources and prestige in the late 19th century. So I don't really quite know whether that's a real thing. And I can't tell in funding agencies whether it's actually a real thing. So it's very hard to answer your question.
Thank you.
Well, we should thank Heather for an incredible